Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As always, thank you for your continued patience. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Sir, as part of your evaluation of the defendant, one of the things that we talked about yesterday was the clinical interview, correct?
Yes.
And the clinical interview is nothing more than you sitting there and talking to the defendant about a variety of topics that may be appropriate, correct?
Well, a mental status is conducted and a history is conducted.
Is that yes or no?
I can't answer that as a yes or no.
So you don't sit there and talk to the defendant during these clinical interviews?
Yes, we talk, sure.
And there are issues that are discussed during these clinical interviews, correct?
Yes.
And basically what happens is you're sitting across a table taking notes while she addresses whatever issue is relevant at that point, correct?
Yes.
And in this particular case, one of the issues that you addressed was whether or not she had had anal intercourse with Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the things that she told you was that he was the only individual ever that she had ever had anal intercourse with, correct?
Early on in our discussions, she did say that.
Well, you're implying that later on in the discussion she told you something different. Isn't it true that that is how it was left? She said, he is the only person that I've ever had anal intercourse with, right?
Yes.
Additionally, one of the things that we've heard was that, and you discussed other aspects of the sexual interaction between her and Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the interactions that you discussed with her was the first interaction where they had oral sex, correct?
Yes.
And she also may have indicated to you that she was uncomfortable about that, correct?
Yes.
But isn't it true, sir, that she has had up to that point, an extensive experience in oral sex?
She had told me she experienced it before then, yes.
And in fact, it started when she was, at least she told you, it started when she was at the age of 15, correct?
Objection relevant.
Overruled.
Yes.
And in fact, she was the one that initiated this oral sex with an individual by the name of Clinton, right?
I don't know if she initiated it or not, but she did engage in it with him.
With an individual by the name of Clinton, correct?
Yes.
And so it isn't a situation that she was uncomfortable because it was a first-time kind of thing with Mr. Alexander, was it?
No, that wasn't it at all.
The other thing that you discussed with her was the computer and what was on the computer. Do you remember talking to her about that?
Whose computer?
Mr. Alexander's computer.
Okay, yes.
And one of the things that you indicated to me was that she told you that that computer had many, many pictures of women's breasts.
Yes.
And that's information you received from the defendant, correct?
Yes.
Do you know whether or not you checked? Do you know who somebody by the name of Lonnie Dworkin is?
No.
Do you know whether or not that computer was ever checked out to see whether or not it had any pictures whatsoever of breasts?
Well, I'm sure that it was.
Pardon?
Well, I'm sure that it was, but pictures of breasts are not illegal.
I'm not saying that they're illegal. We're not talking about that. You understand that. We're talking about the fact that she told you that there were many photographs of women's breasts on Mr. Alexander's computer, right?
Yes.
And what if it turned out that there were no pictures of women's breasts on Mr. Alexander's computer? Would that give you pause in your evaluation in this case of the defendant?
I didn't see it as relevant.
You talked about it, but you don't see it. That's not important, right?
No, it's not important.
So it's not important to you that the defendant may have lied to you during the clinical interview.
Objection to the characterization of lying. There's no information that was even a lie or untruthful in any way.
Approach, please. may continue.
So with regard to this particular computer, assuming that there were no images of women's breasts on it, and you had been told by the defendant that there were, would that give you pause in the evaluation?
There are many possibilities why those images were not on the computer.
I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you, you're not a computer expert, are you?
No, I'm not.
You have testified to a number of things, but that's one thing that you are not, right?
Absolutely.
And so, when you're trying to tell us why there may or may not be many reasons why an image may be or may not be in a computer, you don't have any reason to know what it may be, right?
I saw that as irrelevant to the case.
I understand that you saw it as irrelevant. I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you, my question is this. You indicated to me that the defendant told you that there was, on the computer, images of women's breasts. Lots of them, right?
Yes.
If I say to you, what if it turns out that there are no images of women's breasts on the computer? You can see that there's an inconsistency there, right?
Judge, same objections before.
Right?
Yes, there's an inconsistency.
Right. And if there is an inconsistency with regard to this, and for example, other issues, does that not give you pause while you're conducting an interview, since there are these inconsistencies?
There are certain inconsistencies that are irrelevant to the case.
And so the answer is no. Even though these inconsistencies are there, you're saying, it doesn't matter to me in my evaluation. That's what you're saying, right?
It was not germane to the issue I was investigating.
Right. In other words, you're saying it doesn't matter to you that there were these inconsistencies in this case. Overruled.
Could you repeat your question?
It doesn't matter to you that there are these inconsistencies in this case as they apply to the defendant.
Those particular inconsistencies did not affect my opinion.
I'm not asking you if they affected your opinion. I'm asking you whether or not inconsistencies such as these would give you pause to at least look at what's going on a little deeper in this case.
Objection, Judge, that is the question, and he's already answered it.
Overruled.
Yes, some inconsistencies that were significant to the case, I did investigate further. Those I did not.
But other issues that you deemed, and it's your call, what you're saying right now is, I can look at something and if I consider it irrelevant, generally speaking, they can lie to me because it's not important.
I did not assume that it was a lie.
No, that's not what I'm asking. My hypothetical to you is, generally speaking, not this case, generally speaking, if an individual lies to you about something that you consider irrelevant, then it's no harm, no foul, right?
It depends upon what the issue was related to.
Well, no,
obviously, if it's important to the case and the aspects of the case that I'm studying, I will certainly investigate further. But the fact that whether or not they were pictures of breasts on the computer...
I'm not asking you about that.
You're not letting me finish.
Then Judge is not responsible.
You may finish your response. Objection sustained. Finish your response.
Thank you. The presence or absence of breasts on the computer was not of concern to me because there are many possibilities with my limited knowledge of computers that could account for that. And therefore, since pictures of breasts are legal, and it did not come up anywhere else in the case, I did not see the need to pursue it any further.
Are you done with your answer?
I am not completed with my answer.
Sir, my question was something else. Hypothetically speaking, in a situation where there's something that, as you've just told us now, is irrelevant, you've told us that, in a situation where an individual is involved in a clinical interview like this, and there's an irrelevant issue as you've deemed it, and you find out later that that irrelevant issue, this individual lied to you about that, that still doesn't give you pause at all.
I did not consider it lying. There was a discrepancy
Sir,
between what was
Judge,
on a computer.
he's not being responsive to my questions.
Listen carefully to the question. Repeat your question.
Could you repeat your question?
Sure. Generally speaking, not in this case, if an individual in a case involving something that you say is irrelevant, you've already deemed that it's irrelevant, lies to you about that irrelevant aspect, what you are telling us is that it doesn't matter to you because You've deemed that it's irrelevant.
It's a piece of information, but not to my evaluation, an important piece of information. Obviously, if someone lied to a pertinent and important fact in the evaluation, it would be investigated and it would strike a bell, and I would be far more concerned about it than something which I did not see as being relevant to the issues under study.
So generally speaking, a person, when you're conducting these evaluations, they could lie to you about 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 things that you consider irrelevant. And that's part of the hypothetical that you consider irrelevant. That still would not affect your opinion in the case, correct?
If they were 50,
Overruled.
if they were 50 or 60 points, yes, of course it would raise an alarm to me. But I did not see more than this one.
Sir, you didn't see more than this one in this case?
Well, other than the issues that were under investigation, which were very important.
So other than this issue involving the breast, you didn't see any other inconsistencies in this case? Is that what you just said?
There were inconsistencies in the case.
Yes or no?
I can't answer that with a simple yes or no.
Well, didn't we just discuss the issue of anal intercourse with the defendant, Mr. Alexander?
Yes,
And you told us that she told you that she'd only had anal intercourse with Mr. Alexander, right?
that's right.
What if it turned out that she had anal intercourse with somebody named Bobby Juarez and Daryl Brewer? Would that be important to you?
Yes, it was.
Would that be important then?
Yes.
So if that turned out to be a fact, would that be then something that you would consider important?
Yes.
Let's assume that's the case in this particular circumstance, that those facts that I've just given you are true. Then would that affect your evaluation in this case, and how so?
First of all, the answer is yes. And more information did come out, and she ultimately revealed that she had anal intercourse with 2 other people. But I had written my report by that point.
Judge, sir, my question is, you're telling us, oh, I'm throwing up my hands because I've already written my report at that point, right?
No, I didn't say that.
Well, you said you'd already written your report, right?
That's correct. So in
And
my
sir,
report, it reflects
Judge,
what
he's
she
not
told me
responsive.
initially.
Sir, listen carefully to the question. Repeat your question.
You had written your report by the time you learned those facts, right?
Yes,
And sir, one of the things that you also told us was that you wrote an addendum, right?
that's correct.
So nothing stops you from writing an addendum, does it?
No.
And in fact, you did it in this case, right?
Yes.
And if you would have wanted to, and you thought that it was important enough to the case, you could have done it with regard to this issue involving the anal intercourse and the other aspects that came to your attention, right?
Yes, but my addendum referred to the new material that was
I
provided.
understand that what your addendum referred to, but isn't it a fact that this material that is being brought to you about the anal intercourse, isn't that new material to you?
Yes.
So you just said to me, well, the only reason I did this addendum was because I had new material, right?
I was asked to comment specifically on the new material.
Sir, you just told us that the reason you wrote the addendum was because there was new material, right?
Yes.
This that we're talking about, this issue, you said, well, it came to me later. And you admitted that that was new material, correct?
I was referring to the material that I listed in my addendum as the material that was reviewed for the addendum.
I understand that, sir. I'm not asking you about that particular addendum. I'm asking you about the new material that came after your first addendum.
So what you're saying then is that you're surprised that I didn't mention...
No.
Okay.
My question is this. You're telling us that there's a procedure that you can employ called an addendum when something new comes to light in a case so that you could have a more complete picture of your opinion, right?
Yes.
In this case, something new came out that you considered important, right?
Yes.
And it involved an inconsistency, right?
Yes.
Yet you chose not to write an addendum, right?
I did write an addendum, but I did not include this new information. That is true.
Well, so you did have this new information at the time that you wrote this addendum, and you what, chose to conceal it?
I was writing the addendum specifically on the new written material that was provided to me by the court.
You chose to conceal it or ignore it? What did you do?
I ignored it.
But isn't a person who is conducting a full evaluation on something like this, isn't he duty-bound? Aren't you duty-bound to at least acknowledge it?
I didn't see it as being relevant to my addendum. Obviously, we're dealing with it here in court.
But it was relevant to your original report, wasn't it?
It was relevant, yes.
And so if it's relevant to your original report and not the addendum, you still feel that there is no need to mention it, right?
It was my judgment call not to include it.
And your judgment call, is it because you had formed some sort of relationship with the defendant such that you were kind of, not giving the full picture because you liked her, or what's going on here?
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative. And
Sustained. Sustained.
You chose not to do it, right?
Could you repeat that?
You chose not to address these inconsistencies in any written form,
The
correct?
focus of my addendum was...
Judge, he's not responding to my question.
He's trying to respond to his question.
Restate your question.
Isn't
Listen
it-
carefully to the question.
Isn't it true, sir, that you chose not to include these inconsistencies that you've now told us are relevant in any written form?
Yes,
Sir, there are other things that you discussed with the defendant, though, right?
many things.
One of the things that you discussed with the defendant included the issue of the shower and her taking photographs of Mr. Alexander in the shower, right?
Yes,
And according to what she told you, it was actually Mr. Alexander who requested the photographs, right?
yes.
And did you follow up on that by taking a look at an interview between the defendant and Detective Flores where that issue is addressed?
I believe so.
And there is some conversation there about the victim's reluctance to have his picture taken, isn't there?
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay, and may we approach?
You may. Please go back to the jury. We will bring you back shortly.
Please stand for the jury.
The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. We are in recess for 5 minutes. Dr. Samuels, you may step down.
Judge, before we begin, I'd ask that Dr. Samuels be allowed to make the correction to what the state had said, claimed was true when it wasn't true according to his notes.
Well, you can do that on redirect.
Okay.
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Sir, you wrote a report that codified or indicated this issue or talked about this issue involving the shower and the taking of photographs, correct?
Yes.
Take a look at Exhibit 538. Recognize it?
Well, I'd have to see it in the context of my report.
Well,
so-
why don't you get your report out and take a look at it?
Okay. I have to find the page that it's on. It's not numbered.
What's that?
I have to find the page that it was on. It's not numbered. Here it is. Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry?
What page number?
Oh, it's on page 8 of my report.
And-
Third paragraph.
Is that a true and accurate depiction of what you said involving this issue and the shower?
Yes.
If I may have it back. And she did tell you that it was his request to take pictures of him with the water from the shower running at the time, right?
Yes.
Did you get a chance, as part of the review in this case, to see the interview between the defendant and Detective Flores?
Yes.
And there's an inconsistency there, isn't it?
Well, I think she may have been talking about a different date.
But whether it may be a different date, that's your interpretation of it, right?
Well, from what I gather, from my recollection, it was referring to a different episode because there was not just one taking the photographs in the shower. And I don't recall that. I'd have to see the clip, obviously, to see and get a date of that interview. But if I recall, they were referring to two separate incidents.
That's what you believe, as you sit here today,
That's
correct?
that's what I believe, yes.
You and the defendant also discussed what happened in the closet, right?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the things that she told you was that he was coming after her and that he grabbed her sweater or something like that, and she remembered the gun.
May I see that again within the context of my report?
Well, now let's play it, okay? Let me
I'll
just
play it. Okay.
Yeah, they're way coach. Yes.
Did you want to
Billy.
approach?
You may. You may continue.
Please take a look at exhibit, or listen to Exhibit 539. If you can't listen or hear it, let me know.
No, there's another door, but he's coming after. He grabbed her sweater or something like that, she said. And she remembered the gun, she took the gun and pointed it at him, and then she said, where was the gun? I think it was on a shelf in the closet.
Do you hear that? That is your voice, correct?
Yes.
And that's a conversation that you and I had, correct?
Yes.
And during that conversation, isn't it true that you told me that you discussed with the defendant what happened involving the shooting of Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
And what you told me was that she told you that he grabbed the sweater. Do you hear yourself saying that?
Yes.
And that you also said that it was something like that, and when he grabbed the sweater, she remembered the gun, right?
Something like that. Those are my recollections during that interview.
Well, let's play it again so that we get it clear. And this is 539.
So now she's stuck in the closet? No, there's another door, but he's coming after. He grabbed her sweater or something like that, she said. And she remembered the gun, she took the gun and pointed it at him, and then she said, where was the gun? I think it was on a shelf in the closet.
Did you hear yourself there?
Yes.
And you did say that he grabbed her sweater, right?
Yes.
And this is according to her because you weren't there, right?
That's my characterization. I'm not sure if she actually said sweater or just grabbed onto her, but it's possible that I said sweater.
Well, you did say that, right?
Yes.
Those are your words,
Those
correct?
are my words.
No one has done anything to your words, right?
No.
And you did say that he grabbed her sweater or something like that, right?
Right.
You're indicating that Mr. Alexander according to the defendant, grabbed her by the clothing, right?
Right.
And that they were in the closet when he grabbed her by the clothing, right?
Approximately, yes.
Well, no, that's not what you say. And what you said is he grabbed her sweater or something like that, and she said, and she remembered the gun. So she remembers the gun at the time that he's grabbing her by the sweater or the clothing, right?
That's what I recalled her telling me, yes, but I do have it in my notes here.
I'm not,
Judge, may we approach?
May. You may continue.
you said that you have your notes in front of you, right?
Yes.
And it references this, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And why don't you tell me what your notes say with regard to this grabbing of the sweater? And what is the exhibit that you're looking at, sir?
I'm looking at my notes from 4/21/10.
I know, what's the exhibit number? It's the green tag.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was so far. 537.
Right?
Would you like me to read this whole incident?
No, I want you to read the part about involving the sweater.
Well, there's nothing in here that specifically says sweater.
But we had this conversation and you told me about it, right?
Right.
But you did tell me during that conversation that he grabbed her, right?
That's correct.
And he grabbed an article of her clothing, right?
That's right. He did grab some article of it.
Right. And at the time that your notes reflect this, at the time that he grabbed this article of clothing is when she remembered the gun, right?
That's right.
And then that's when she got the gun, right?
That's what was told to me, yes.
And that's what you have in your notes, right?
Yes.
There was an issue as to whether or not you were unclear as to whether or not she shot him in the closet or not, right?
That's right.
You were at one point of the opinion that she did shoot him in the closet at one point, right?
I don't recall. What do you count? You're not referring to my report, are you?
Sure. Take a look at your notes as to whether or not you ever indicate in there that she shot him in the closet once, and maybe you indicate something else somewhere else.
No, I know that they went into the closet. Oh, she went into the closet, grabbed the gun in an attempt.
Don't read, sir. Don't read it to us. I want you to refresh your
Well,
recollection.
I am referring. Okay, I see. what you're saying.
Silently.
Okay, and she remembered the gun, pointed the gun. Doesn't specifically remember the gun being shot. In an attempt.
But I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you where.
It
Where was she?
around the closet, whether it was
All right.
in or around the closet.
Okay.
That wasn't as important to me.
I understand that it's not as important to you, but what your notes reflect that it was in or around the closet when she fired the gun, right?
Yes.
All right. Sir, one of the other tests that you administered was this Milan test, correct?
The Milan.
Milan. It's MCMI, right?
Yes.
And sir, yesterday, one of the things we were talking about was the answers to questions, or the questions in the other test, the PSD test, 15 through whatever the remainder were. Did you bring those with you?
I did.
May I take a look at them, please?
Sure. What specifically are you looking for?
The questions to the PSD.
Yes, I have those.
If I may have it. And sir, this is the packet of questions that you sort of put under the, or in front of the defendant, so that she could answer, correct?
Yes.
Well, then why is it, sir, that it was faxed to you on January 22nd of 2010? I mean, don't you just have these sitting around, or what?
Those questions?
Yeah.
It's probably just a fax that I have laying around. I made a copy of something I had in my drawer for purposes of court.
But
That's not necessarily the exact set of questions that I handed her. I have about 10 copies of that.
Well, what I'm talking about, sir, is that, take a look at Exhibit 534.
Which exhibit is that, sir?
I'm going to show it to you once it comes on the monitor, and I'll do it right now. It's not. I do have a document on it. Just to see if it will work. There we go. This is the PDS that you told us yesterday you administered to the defendant, correct?
Yes.
And the date on there is January 15th of 2010, correct?
Right.
Whereas the date on this one here, 540, is January 22nd of 2010, correct?
No, you're incorrect. That may be the date that's on there, but that's not the same list of questions that I gave her. I have numerous copies in my office, and I simply prepared copies for court and stapled groups together. That's not the same copy that was given to her. The fax date on there is irrelevant.
So what you're saying is what you gave me is not the paperwork that you actually gave her. It's a copy of what you gave her.
It's a copy of what I gave her, yes.
What happened to the one that you actually gave her?
It's somewhere in my drawer. I have 10 copies of questions, and I take them with me when I use it. I get the questions back. I put them back in my drawer so that I can use them again.
So this is something that you keep reusing again over and over.
The questions, yes.
And you don't keep a separate sheet in the file of the person that you conducted the
That
test
would be
on.
unnecessary.
So the answer is no, you don't.
Could you repeat the particular question that you want me to say
You
yes or no to?
don't keep the actual questions along with the answers as part of the file.
Not the one that was touched by the client necessarily, no.
Do you keep a copy of the questions along with the answers in the file always?
No.
In other words, what you're telling us, I believe, is that you only keep the answers, you don't keep the questions in the file.
That's correct. It's unnecessary.
And yesterday we looked at my copy, but basically this is sort of what I showed you yesterday, right?
Yes.
Part 1 that we previously discussed, and Part 2 what we previously discussed, correct?
Yes.
I move for the admission of exhibit number 540.
540 is admitted.
You see question 15 here?
Yes.
If we then go to question 15, it says, how long ago did this traumatic event happen? Do you see that?
Yes.
What's the answer?
Well, why don't we take first a look at item 14
Right.
to see which one she marked off. And
Number
that
4.
That was number 4, a non-sexual assault by a stranger.
Right. And how long ago was it?
That she indicated in
Yes.
here?
Yes.
15, 4. 6 months to 3 years.
And we're again talking about this incident that she described to you when a guy and a girl came in and killed Mr. Alexander, correct? Because that's what she's describing to you previous to this, right?
Yes, I believe so.
And during this traumatic event, she was asked if she was, number 16, physically injured. Right?
Yes.
And her answer was, there's
Yes.
2 of them. Well, no, there's a yes and there's a no. Is it? So it's a yes, is
She
that what we're
checked
looking?
off under the yes.
Okay. And then 17 was someone else physically injured? She said yes, correct?
Yes.
Number 18, did you think that your life was in danger? And she said yes.
Yes.
And she was in danger from these 2 individuals, correct?
Yes, at that time.
Right. But this is when she filled this out, right?
Yes.
And number 19, did you think that someone else's life was in danger? Of course, she's talking about Mr. Alexander based on what she told you, right?
Yes.
And number 20, she was asked if she felt helpless. And 21, if she felt terrified, right?
Well, yes, you have that. It's covered, but yes, that's what I would call it.
And she felt helpless and terrified because of these 2 individuals that had come into Mr. Alexander's house, right?
Right, or something that occurred at that time.
Well, no. At this particular time, the story was that, or her statement to you was that a man and a woman had come in and killed Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
And that was your realm of knowledge at that point, correct, when you administered this, right?
Yes.
And then for the next part, part 3, it does have a legend, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
It has a legend.
Yes.
0 is not at all or only one time. 1 is once a week or less. 2 is 2 to 4 times a week. And 4 is 5 or more times a week.
Yes.
Correct? So if we go to question 22, it says, having upsetting thoughts or images about the traumatic event that came into your head when you didn't want them to. 22, she said number 3, which is 5 or more times a week, almost always, right?
Yes.
And these images are of these 2 individuals coming in and killing Mr. Alexander, right?
Well, yeah, at that time, yes, that's what I believed.
And 23, she was asked if she had any bad dreams or nightmares about this killing of Mr. Alexander by these 2 people, and she said 0, right?
That's correct.
Which means that not at all or only one time,
Yes.
right? One of the things that you told us was that she was having trouble sleeping. Do you remember that?
I do.
But if she was having trouble sleeping, it wasn't because of this event involving this man and this woman that came in, right?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Based on this, she does say she doesn't have any nightmares about the traumatic event, right?
Correct.
In terms of reliving the event, number 24, she answered 1, which is once a week or less, right?
Yes.
And again, we're talking about the same event at that point involved a man and a woman, right?
Well, we don't know that.
Well, yeah, you do know that because that's what she told you at that
But that's
time,
what
right?
she told me, but I want to make it very, very clear.
Is that what she told you?
Objection, Judge, may he finish his answer, please?
Yes.
I'd like to make it clear to you that she's responding to some trauma. Nowhere on the test, except when it asks to describe the trauma, is the trauma, specific trauma, that important. In other words, it's not critical to the outcome of the test. In her thinking and in her responsiveness, she could have been responding to the trauma that occurred on that date. Granted, she told me one story, and we found out later that there was another story, but both would have been perceived as traumas. So it's possible, and I'm not saying that it is for sure, it's possible that the trauma she was referring to was actually due to the killing. But because of the story she constructed, she had to attribute it rather, to this made-up story.
You don't know that, do you?
No, I don't. I'm speculating.
Right. Made it up right now. Speculating.
No clinical judgment, sir.
That's made up.
Overruled.
Clinical judgment.
Sir, you just used the word speculating, didn't you?
Okay, I used the word. I misspoke.
Sure. And speculating means it could be made up, right?
Yes, that's one possibility. It could be made.
All right. Thank you. In terms of question 34, you said, the question was, are you having trouble falling or staying asleep? You said that? See that?
Yes.
And question 34, her answer was number 2, right?
Yes.
Which is 2 to 4 times a week, right?
Yes.
But it doesn't involve any nightmares involving this traumatic event.
That's correct.
She was asked on part 4, indicate if the problems you rated in part 3 have interfered with any of the following areas. Correct? You see that?
Yes.
And she says, except for 45, schoolwork, that all of this has interfered with work, household chores, relationships with friends, her sex life, right?
Yes.
General satisfaction with life, and overall level of functioning in all areas of her life, right?
That's correct.
And the event that we're talking about is the killing of Mr. Alexander by these 2 individuals.
Well, she was incarcerated at the time.
Sir,
Overruled. You may answer.
She was incarcerated at the time, and therefore all of her life activities were impeded.
those are the answers, those are the questions, and those are the responses, right?
That's correct.
The other test that you conducted was the MCMI, right?
Correct.
Are you familiar with the MMPI?
I am.
And what does that stand for?
The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
And how many questions does that have, sir?
567.
And who is that normed to?
Who is that normed to? Well, there's several subpopulations,
Sure.
but it's normed to primarily individuals who are in therapy.
So you're saying the MMPI is a norm to people in therapy?
As a rule, yes.
And so if you're not in therapy, then it's not norm to you?
Well, there are some subpopulations that it's sampled to.
So you have to be in therapy. In other words, everybody that provided the information for the MMPI, you're saying had to be in some sort of therapy,
There are
right?
several different scales. There's a correctional scale. There's people that are in therapy. There's also another scale for those people perhaps that are involved with physical ailments. There are several different ways that you can have that test scored.
And there's all these questions, and it does have a validity scale, right?
Yes, it does.
And you are saying that it is not geared to the normal population. Is that what you're saying? The
Primarily, it involves, that's right, it involves people that have been diagnosed with some disorder.
But it is for the normal population, correct?
When you say normal, what do you mean?
I'm talking about somebody who is out in the population. There's an issue as to what their diagnosis is, and this is one of the tests that they give.
That's one of the tests that's used to help diagnose.
But you chose to give one that had 175 questions, right?
That's correct.
And that one, sir, the way it works is that gives you a number, right? A base rate, if you will, a number, doesn't it?
No.
Well, you talked about it on direct examination, and isn't there something called the final base rate score that it gives you?
Well, it doesn't just give you one score.
Well-
It gives you numerous scores and scales. To limit your results to one number is a very narrow approach to that test.
Am I asking you to narrow your approach to one number right now?
Well, you are. You're saying that there's one number there called the base rate score.
Well, there's a lot of base rate scores here, right?
Yes, for several different factors.
Let's take a look at these right here. Take a look at Exhibit 541. You recognize what's in 541?
Yes.
What is it?
This is a printout from the MCMI profile.
And what's behind it?
What's behind it?
Yes.
Those are the base rate scores for approximately 25 different characteristics.
And for who are they?
These are from Ms. Arias.
All right?
May we approach? Yes.
I move for the admission of Exhibit 541.
Objection.
541 is admitted.
Take a look at the second page, and this is talking about base rate scores, correct?
Yes,
Then we have a 60, and then we have a 75, right?
correct.
The indication between 60 and 75 is that that does not indicate the presence of any clinical diagnosis, correct?
It's below the cutoff point.
Right, the cutoff is the 75, right?
Yes, however, that's an
Yes or no?
improper use of,
Is it? You just said that. It is, isn't it?
but that's an improper use of the test.
I'm not asking you if that's an improper use of the test. You just told me that that's the cutoff, right?
Typically speaking, when we're analyzing the data in some specific ways, but there are very complex computer algorithms that allow us to compare the relative heights of these scales and form a clinical opinion based upon the relative heights. It's not just a matter of taking a scale and measuring the score. It's more complex than that.
This document that you have here is the document MCMI3 base rate scores. This is something that you attached to your report, correct?
Yes,
And it is for Miss Arias, right?
correct.
And you've also just told me that for the diagnosis issue, it's 75 to 85. That indicates the presence of some sort of, if you will, clinical disorder, right?
Relative elevations are as important as absolute elevations.
I understand that, but you just indicated this is where the clinical diagnosis comes in of any disorder.
No,
right?
that's not, as I said, that's an improper use of the interpretation of this test.
So then why have numbers then? If they're not going to mean anything, then why have a number there?
They do have a meaning, but
And
not the meaning you are giving to them.
Well, if we then take a look at her profile, take a look at the PTSD. Do you
Yes.
see that?
Yes.
It's got 10, and her unadjusted score is what?
You're looking at a score that has
Sir,
no meaning.
I understand that that's what you want to tell us. What is the number that I'm pointing to there?
69.
And if we move that over, what is the number that's right across from that?
69.
So with regard to Miss Arias, the number, even though you want to interpret it, the number that the computer assigned to it is 69, right?
You're misinterpreting the
I-
value of the test. You have no knowledge in this area. So
Right. I understand that you
Yeah.
say I have no knowledge, but you can see the number there, can't you?
Of course,
And what is that number there?
69.
And it's both for the adjusted, unadjusted, and the final, right?
Yes.
If we then go over to your base rate scores, you see there's the 60, then there's a 75 to 85. Her PTSD score of 69 is below the 75, correct?
The 75 doesn't mean anything.
Right, it doesn't mean anything. That's why they threw it in there, right?
You're misinterpreting
No.
I studied these tests for years,
I know.
and you are misinterpreting it, sir.
Right. They put that number 75 because it doesn't mean a thing, right?
It means something, but not the way you're saying it.
Well, it is, mathematically speaking, 69 is below 75, isn't it?
Well, of course.
And if we're talking about this computer printout and PTSD and this issue involving whether or not there's a clinical disorder, the clinical disorder falls between the 75 and the 85 is what you previously told me, right?
That is not right.
Well, that's what you told me before, right?
Objection, Ms. characterizes this testimony.
Overruled. You may
What I'm telling you
No,
is that
Judge, he's being non-responsive.
I'm not going to be characterized as giving you the wrong information. Yes.
listen carefully to the question. Mr. Martinez, restate your question.
With regard to this issue here between the 75 and the 85, do you remember previously telling me that that is an area that indicates a clinical disorder?
No, I don't remember saying that, and if I did, I misspoke.
So do you have any problems with your memory because this just happened?
No, I do not have problems with my memory, sir.
And this MMPI, this MCMI, sir, this actually is a test that is was developed on psychiatric patients, correct?
Yes.
And the psychiatric patients were the reference group, right?
Yes.
And it was the psychiatric patients that were the reference group rather than individuals drawn from the general population, right?
Correct.
Whereas for the MMPI, there were individuals from the general population, correct?
As well.
No, the MMPI is different because that, sir, draws individuals from the general population, not psychiatric patients, right?
There are subpopulations that have been validated on the MMPI as well.
I know, but the question is this, sir, isn't it true that the MMPI involves individuals drawn from the general population, whereas this test involves people who are psychiatric patients?
Yes, and that's why I use this test.
The defendant is not a psychiatric patient, is she?
Well, I hypothesized that she had a psychiatric condition, and therefore I felt this test was much more appropriate for her to confirm a hypothesis that I had made based upon my analysis of all the other information that I had a chance to review.
And this test, sir, measures or indicates the person who's taking this test, they're standing on the scales as compared only with other psychiatric patients, right?
Yes.
Not with the general population.
There are actually several different validated groups for the MCMI, but this particular one was validated on psychiatric.
Right, and so what we're doing here is we're comparing her answers, if you will, to those of psychiatric patients, right?
Yes.
This scoring system here does not allow for her scores to be interpreted according to a criterion of normality that would be important to assess in a court case, right?
I was comparing her diagnostic...
Yes or no?
Could you repeat your question, please?
Isn't it true that this instrument, the one that you gave her, the MCMI, does not allow for a defendant or the client score to be interpreted according to a criterion of normality that may be important, may be an important factor to assess in a court case?
Well, that's correct by itself. That's true.
Right. It's saying basically that this is not something that is set up to be used in a court case.
No, that's not what it says.
Well, it does say this instrument does not allow for a client's or a defendant's score to be interpreted according to a criterion of normality that might be an important factor to assess in a court case. Yes or no?
That's what it says. And what are you reading from, sir?
And Sir, I asked the questions. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay. The base rate that we've talked about, and that's what we're talking about here. You
Yes.
see that? Those base rate norms do not allow, sir, in this case, for the description of normal behavior because there is no normal reference group, right?
That's right, but I was looking for a...
Yes or no? You answered my
Would
question,
I'd
right?
like to know what you're reading from, sir. Looks like that could refresh my memory.
And, sir, with regard to this test,
Your Honor, can we have the state disclose to the witness so that he understands? He's directly quoting from an article, and it's maybe quoted out of text without the doctor knowing exactly what he's talking about.
All right, we're going to take the noon recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, please be back in the designated area 125. Please remember the admonition you have used. Please approach. Please left the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Counsel, please approach.